Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today we have got Erec Smith and Jason Littlefield with us. Little background, Erec Smith, he's a professor of rhetoric at York College, and he's the author of a new book that's out called A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition. He's also the founder of Free Black Thought. Jason Littlefield was a former teacher in the Austin Independent School District. He was an SEL, social and emotional learning coach. He just left that. We'll hear a little bit more about that to start his own SEL venture called Empower Pathways. So before we get to all of that, the first question is, what did we bring to the table? So Erec, did you bring a drink?
Sure did. Gatorade.
Well, what's the flavor?
Crisp and yes. I don't know. I'm old school. I like yellow and red. That's all I needed. Now everything's too fancy for me, but that's what I'm drinking.
All right, then. And Jason, what about you?
I'm floating back and forth between black coffee and ice water.
Okay. All right. And David, you're not doing a McDonald's Diet Coke today?
No. I'm doing bourbon, yes. Kentucky bourbon.
Okay. Well, then I have to tell you, I'm very proud of you because you are the only one drinking alcohol. Well, no, that's not true. I've got a virgin vodka lime, also known as water. But I want you guys to note that I put little pinwheels on it to make my water look fancy.
There
you go. So
cheers, everybody.
Makes all the difference.
Yeah. Glasses make a difference. So, all right, you two. So I know Jason and Erec, you guys are both working together on several projects. You're working together at Free Black Thought. You're also working together with a theory of empowerment. And both of you, empowerment is a big deal for both of you. Erec, you write on this a lot. Your new book talks about empowerment. I'll start with you. Can you, for people who might not know, can you just lay out for us what is the theory of empowerment?
Well, yes. First, I should say that I didn't come up with this by any means. Psychologist Mark Zimmerman, Douglas Perkins, and a social worker named Judith Lee were my inspirations. They discuss and use empowerment theory in their work. And when I looked at empowerment theory, I saw a couple of things. I saw something that was inherently rhetorical. A lot of things are, but this is especially is for reasons I'll get into in a second. And then second, it was a nice potential alternative for what's being called CRT these days, and how that manifests as implicit bias training, as well as pedagogy in higher ed, and even to some extent K through 12. So what is empowerment theory? Okay, there are three components to empowerment theory: the intrapersonal, the interactional, and the behavioral. The intrapersonal is all about self-awareness, self-management. I'm sure Jason is familiar with all those things from SEL, right? Mindfulness, how to develop positive self-regard, which is looking at your strengths and weaknesses fairly realistically, so that you can better, get rid of those weaknesses, right? And even strengthen those strengths. And so that's rhetorical because basically it's how we talk to ourselves, how we convince ourselves, to develop intrinsic motivation, how we convince ourselves of how to look at certain things, how we interpret narratives that we seem to be in, and we're often in those narratives unconsciously. So the interpersonal helps us pay attention to that. In fact, there's a term in my field called internal rhetorics, which is basically the concept of mindfulness, but, you're basically talking to yourself, right? You're using rhetoric on yourself. The interactional is the next component, and that is about organizational awareness, social awareness, relationship building, how we talk to each other, how we enter into different communities with different discourses therein, and navigate it effectively. The last component is the behavioral. And what that is teamwork, getting things done. So it's the interactional applied to actually fulfilling a goal. Another term for it I've discovered is improvement science, which is basically taking the pedagogical concept of problem-based learning and applying it to the world at large, right? So problem-based learning is in a classroom and outside of a classroom, but improvement science is that same idea outside of the classroom and for, pretty much everyone. And it's all about finding a problem in your immediate environment and working with other people also interested and invested in improving the environment and working together to the best of your ability to improve things, right? And it can be from, potholes in a road to, certain policies in your municipality or something like that. So all three of those components come together to make empowerment, and you have to have all three to be truly empowered, right? So that's what's going on with that. And I think it's a nice, you can see where rhetoric comes in with the interpersonal and the interactional and the behavioral. It's all about communication, even if it's communication with just yourself, right? It's imperative. I think it's a nice alternative to current implicit bias and DEI training mainly. Well, there are a lot of reasons. I'll just give one here. A lot of those trainings, even the ones that are well intentioned, they skip the interpersonal. They go straight to the interactional, and that's the problem, because when we enter into certain difficult conversations in difficult environments, we're not ready for it. We're bringing our own baggage. We're there less to communicate and more to defend our egos, right? Where we didn't take the proper step beforehand to enter into that conversation with an open mind, heart, and will, right? So a lot of anti-racist trainings, they skip the interpersonal and go straight to the interactional. I think that's a problem. So I want to do this in a way that emphasizes the interpersonal, and then the interactional, and then the behavioral, and then obviously discuss how all those things really overlap for empowerment. And another difference, I'll stop talking, is that with current implicit bias training, DEI training, there's at least a tacit understanding that it's white people who need to change. They need this training, and everybody else is just here to make sure the training gets done, or to make sure certain problems or mistakes are remedied, called out and remedied. Empowerment theory is for everybody, especially when it comes to the interpersonal and understanding the stories we tell ourselves and the lenses through which we tend to see the world, being cognizant of those things. How we talk to ourselves about it, right? So, yeah, that's about it. I'll stop there.
Well, that's a nice introduction then for what Jason has been doing. Jason, if you want to tell us a little bit, I know empowerment is also the basis of your new venture in social and emotional learning. So can you tell us a little bit about how you're tackling this, and add to it though why? I know your story. I think your story would be very interesting also to our listeners.
I would first like to discuss how the framework that I've developed really melds with empowerment theory, and how those two, just to show what Erec and I are looking to do, and how what we've been working on separately in separate parts of the country in separate fields really goes together. Erec talked about the interpersonal. One of the tools of the compassionate humanism framework is that notice the narrative, to teach people how to notice the narrative that we tell ourselves about, that narrative we tell ourselves about ourselves, the narrative we tell ourselves about other people, and even the world around us, and how to disrupt thoughts of judgment and fear, because those are the first things that typically pop up. So to notice mindsets and thoughts of judgment and fear, especially when those thoughts may limit others' human potential, and to replace those thoughts with inquiry and compassion. So that's how the compassionate humanism really in, interacts and plays off of the interpersonal that Eric mentioned. And then with the interactional, the other component is that compassionate humanism centers human dignity uh, as a way of interacting with each other. And by human dignity, what I really am referring to is distinguishing the human from the being, and to acknowledge what that means. And what that means is separating what you see here. This is the result of my biology, and what you're interacting with is the result of my conditioned personality. And we all have thousands of differences there. But as beneath that human level is the being, and despite all of those biological and personality differences, our beings have only two qualities, and all humans share those two qualities, and that's the desire to avoid suffering and the desire to alleviate suffering when we encounter that. So if that's the level that we can get at whenever we're interacting with each other, the amount of harm, the amount of racism, all of those things will deteriorate. And then the final component of empowerment theory that Eric mentioned was the behavioral. And that's where the three pathways of practice come in. And the three pathways of practice of the compassionate humanism framework are practices that build awareness and equanimity, such as mindfulness. And then by front loading self awareness, what I like to talk about is, what is your aim? What are you aiming for? What are you working towards? And how are you doing that? And alignment. And by alignment, are you working towards your aim in alignment with your core values? And then awe. How do you evoke a sense of awe? How do you connect with something greater than you? Um, and routinely do those things. And then also practices that celebrate our common humanity and break the walls of indignity. So really finding opportunities to celebrate and identify our similarities from our shared past, so we can also make preparations and plans for our hopeful shared future. And then finally is practices that build kindness and compassion for self and others. So by doing those three pathways of practice and centering human dignity and disrupting those mindsets of fear and judgment and replacing them with thoughts of inquiry and compassion, this is how we can really address the human condition that we're in now, because we're spinning wheels getting nowhere for a political objective that does not meet what is best for humans. So I'm really, really looking forward to tackling this and really doing some amazing things with you, Eric.
Likewise.
So, first of all, I think it's fantastic. Let me just get that out of the way. It's and very much needed in today's discourse. But I'm going to probe a little bit on this idea of whether it's really an alternative to critical race theory. Critical race theory is an explanatory framework. It answers the question, why is there, or attempts to answer the question, why is there disparity in the world? And it offers a set of theories having to do with systemic racism and systems bias and the like. Whereas empowerment theory, it sounds to me, is it puts the onus on the individual to perform, to grow, to learn how to adapt to changing conditions and the like. But it doesn't offer an explanatory framework for why there's disparity, unless I'm missing something here. And I'm wondering if there's a version of this, or if you could take empowerment theory and turn it into an explanatory framework for why there's disparity as well, that would sort of compete in the public square with the assertions made by critical race theory.
Yeah, I would like to answer that. When I say, when most people say critical race theory, they're not talking about the theory so much as they're talking about the practice in educational context and in the workplace and things like that. And they're not thinking about explaining disparities and things like that. What they're complaining about is what's probably more accurately called critical social justice or critical white studies. And these are both derived from critical race theory, but they tend to be critical race theory in practice. And in practice, that's where things get problematic. I think the rising term right now is divisive concepts. There are certain ways of approaching DEI trainings, for example, that are seen as divisive, putting certain people in certain categories based on race or sex or something like that, treating people differently based on those immutable concepts, right? So when I say it's a replacement for CRT, I'm really saying it's a replacement for the practice of critical social justice in workplace trainings and educational spaces. What empowerment theory can do, what it's supposed to do, is not really replace understanding or acknowledging racial disparities. It's presenting a better way to approach it, right? So if you perfect, quote unquote, empowerment theory, you will be better able to address those disparities and get things done. To have concrete strategies that you come up with other people to get things done. So it's not saying ignore the racial disparities. It's saying empower yourself so that you can deal with those racial disparities in productive ways. And I think that's missing from current DEI trainings and pedagogy.
It absolutely is. And I think it's very important. Yesterday, I spoke to an African-American Jewish woman who said, I grew up under much more difficult conditions than my kids did. But I ended up making it. She got her master's in social work, her master's in international relations, and her doctorate in education. She said, I ended up making it, by empowering myself in a way. If I was told that white supremacy was likely to hold me down, it probably would have. And I guess my question, though, is there a competing notion to the idea, to the explanation of disparity that is simpatico with empowerment theory? And I agree with you, even critical social justice is not just a practice in terms of what we do to deal with disparity. It also makes assertions about why there's disparity in the world, if I'm not mistaken. It says that there's disparity because there's oppressed and there are oppressors, and the oppressors cause the conditions of the oppressed, which is true, by the way, I think in certain circumstances, and maybe partially true in others and maybe not true in others. And so how do we bring those concepts together?
I can answer that.
Please.
Okay. Well, actually, I had a much better answer in my head before I said I can answer that. Now I got to remember. But let me repeat the question I think I heard. How are we also dealing with disparities, right? How are we addressing those?
How are we explaining them also? How are we?
Well, what empowerment theory does, it brings back an appreciation for context, right? With a lot of these things, context is all but dead. You're applying these universal ideas to a specific situation to the point where okay, you're white, this person's black, you're disagreeing with this person, therefore you're racist. Somehow this is racist. And that goes back to D'Angelo and her tenets of anti-racist education and things like that. But that's acontextual. You're not looking at the specific situation and engaging it accordingly and acting accordingly. What empowerment theory does, especially when you get to the interactional and the behavioral, it's looking at this specific situation pragmatically, which is to say, okay, based on what we have here, who's in the room, what the problem is, how can we handle this? How can we get along? And how can we collaborate to improve the world, right? So that's how I see, empowerment theory working with these disparities. Is looking at it one situation at a time, as opposed to just having this universal blanket of meaning that you apply to everything.
Sounds like to me that theory of empowerment could be used as a framework to teach DEI, SEL, all this kind of stuff. It's an actual framework itself versus trying to replace CRT or anything like that. Did I hear you right?
Yes. That's more accurate.
Okay. Well, on that note, first of all, I've got to interject because I've got to laugh about something because everyone can hear that Jason, even though we're both from Texas, he has a great Texas accent. And when you first started talking about being, I thought you said bean. And it took me a minute to go, oh, that's his Texas accent. So for anyone else who needs interpretation, bean, that bean is bean. Bean. I love it. Now you already know I love your accent. I just I haven't turned mine on yet. Maybe I'll do that later. But I wanted to ask you on that note. So, as a theory of empowerment is a framework, I know that you were in the SEL space in public school. Can you tell us where that went sideways, and the reason that you're applying now the theory of empowerment in your own work and in your own paradigm for teaching SEL?
So SEL officially went off the rails in December of 2020 by officially becoming a lever for equity and social justice. And by equity, they're talking about equal outcomes. So there's this idea in the culture now of promoting equal outcomes. And I would say about 3 years ago, I started going to colleagues, on a one-on-one basis, and saying, "Hey, these ideas that we're putting forth is historically rooted in Marxist thought, and it's negatively impacting the social and emotional well-being of the individual." I got a lot of pushback on that. Something I heard Eric mention in a in a previous interview was because part of Eric's story, I won't tell his story, but part of that story is raising questions about practices and things that were being said and the reaction. And he said the reaction changed me. So the reaction that I was met with changed me, and I started to really look at what was happening within our culture, work trainings, and the ideas that we were putting out in the schools. And what I believe is that the whole CRT is good, CRT is bad. The whole CRT debate that is happening is not really the conversation to be had. And the conversation to be had is, looking at what Eric's doing with empowerment theory, and looking at the compassionate humanism framework that I've worked on, is that it's not as, is racism real or does it exist? Are there disparities? It's the question of how do we want to address them? Is it through the the liberal framework, the classic liberalism of the rights of the individual, that framework, or is it through this postmodern neo-Marxist CRT framework? Like which framework best aligns with your personal values, and which worldview and narrative do you feel is beneficial for the future of humanity? And people need to, I feel, choose one of those positions. Like, yes, I believe in the postmodern neo-Marxist movement, or you know what, I do believe in the rights of the individual. Eric and I are wanting to build up the individual, rather than tear down and burn everything down, because society is essentially divided into builders and destroyers right now, and the telos, the purpose of the destruction, is destroy, is a constant state of destroying, and I believe that idea is created a crisis on meaning making, and the mental health crisis. So back to SEL, I that whole idea of there is something in the school, in the K-12 system, that is designed to fortify and strengthen the individual, is now purposed for essentially destroying the individual. And I chose to step away from that and to pursue avenues, to figure out how do we not only reverse this trend, but really provide something, and begin building up.
Jason, there a lot of the people who are advocating for sort of a CRT oriented change in education, whether it's actual CRT or not is another question, are denying that there's any real change happening. They think it's a figment of our imagination. What evidence do you have through your own experience in the school system that tells you that there has been a significant change underway that needs to be pushed back in favor of more traditional social emotional learning?
Uh, I'll kind of start by going backwards. So as earlier I mentioned, that I've tried to have conversations with colleagues, uh, professional conversations about this movement and what it was doing and what it was about. And one of the final things that I said just a few months ago was, at the root of this movement is an attack on human dignity and a rejection of the Enlightenment. And after that statement, I was told to just don't talk about it anymore.
And this was
So
where, in what context?
uh, this was in a professional meeting, a CRT based kind of discussion and conversation going on, because I've tried several avenues to approach this and to approach people and to really have open dialogue about what are the practices, what are the ideas that we're advancing. So the fact that in public education, people are okay rejecting the Enlightenment, and rejecting a notion of a shared truth, and rejecting the notion that we are a common humanity. We do have a shared history as a species, and telling kids you are this because of your skin color and your gender. So we are giving the narrative to the next generation right now. Like it's trickled down, into society, that beginning August, we are putting this narrative. We're essentially installing new software, in the minds of the younger children.
Mm.
And that idea is to destroy, and there is no truth, and intense tribalism. Which
do you think this is happening outside of your own school context? Do you see evidence that this is happening in other nearby school systems, in other states, in other counties?
Through reading educator blogs, educator magazines and trends, and following that is the only idea that's out there right now. And the tricky part is that it's rooted in love and compassion and contains a kernel of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You know, you have kind-hearted and compassionate and well-intended people using a tool that is purposed for destruction. So no matter what is in their heart, no matter what is in their mind, if they're using tools purposed for destruction, that's what's going to happen.
So do you have a question, Jennifer? Or I have
you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. So Jennifer and I interviewed a trans woman activist named Deborah Hayden, who said something that I thought might apply to this discussion as well. She was talking about how it's a lot to demand of people who are not trans to use pronouns, to make all the adjustments in their understanding of trans people, to change their view of restrooms and the rest. She said there's a lot, and that trans people need to meet them halfway. And I'm wondering if there's a halfway mark between the ideas that are promulgated in CRT, which basically says the system is at fault, and those that are in empowerment theory that says the individual must take on responsibility, whereby both the system diversifies and allows for different approaches that might be more respectful of human dignity in that way, and that the individual has also a responsibility to empower themselves within a system that may not be perfect, will never be perfect, will always make demands of them that are not perfectly fitted to them as an individual. What is your view on that?
Well, with empowerment theory, remember the intrapersonal, which is the most individualistic component of empowerment, it's just 1/3 of it. You know, and these components work as checks and balances, right? So there's no danger of hyper individuality because the interactional is all about working, you know, with other people and collaborating and negotiating meaning, right? Socially constructing things, understanding already socially constructed things. You know, these are collaborative things. So you have to kind of relinquish the individuality and work with other people. And then behavioral is comparable, but you know, with a clear telos, right? So yes, what we're doing, we're bringing back individuality as a value. That's for sure. But we're also acknowledging that no man or woman is an island, and that we, you know, on an ontological level, we're combined, you know, in that sense. We can't really live without, you know, other people, and that's also embraced in empowerment theory. So yes, we're bringing back the individuality, right? But it's not a hyper individuality.
It's not, and you're not denying that systems matter and that systems might in fact oppress people in a certain way who don't fit into the system so neatly.
Right. The interactional is about organizational awareness, social awareness, recognizing those systems so that we can do something about it. You know, so there's a level of what's called reality testing here too. You know, we're looking at the world for what it is, or a particular environment for what it is, and figuring out how to best navigate it together, right? So yes, I mean, this is not, nobody's denying, you know, the power of systems. Nobody's denying the presence of racism in various situations. What we're trying to do is figure out a more productive way of approaching things like that and other issues.
You know what I love about that, Eric? You said something about bringing back in context, and I I just love that word because I do feel like where we've created more of these monolithic group identities, there is absolutely no context. And these identities nowadays are based basically, almost solely on the color of your skin or your gender. And so these very binary systems. But I'd like to talk to you, both of you. Rhetoric, I know, is your jam. So, how have we gotten to this place rhetorically where we have gone from the individual, because talking about individuality, I mean, it's almost like you're a rebel now, right? I mean, that's what Republicans do. Like Trump talks about that, right? I mean, and it's the most ridiculous thing because the individuality is something that it at one point a huge value of ours, and now it's become submerged to group identities. And so how did we get there rhetorically where that had how do we manage our language to get us in this place? And this goes to what Jason also said on meaning making. I mean, I think we've changed and we've manipulated the meaning of certain words to move us from individuality, making that kind of taboo, to cherishing and upholding group identity as the pinnacle.
Well, I have an answer to that.
Please, well, I'd love
I think
it.
I do. I think I do anyway. The narratives, or the meta narrative that around contemporary anti-racism, for example, the definitions of words that have been changed in contemporary anti-racism. All of these derive from basically one thing: a blanket mistrust of classical liberal values, which includes individuality, freedom of speech, equality, right? Deliberative democracy. All of those things are considered concepts that maintain the status quo, and the status quo is white supremacy, right? So suddenly those things are not trusted anymore. Reason, scientific method, those things are not trusted anymore because they're not doing the trick. We need to do something else. So we need to move beyond individuality. We need to move beyond,
Meritocracy.
reason, right? And we have to throw those things away and do something else. What's more, and people don't talk about this enough, Derek Bell is arguably the founding father of critical race theory, and by extent, I guess the grandfather of critical social justice and critical whiteness studies and things like that. He wrote an essay in the early '90s, if I'm not mistaken, towards the beginning of CRT as a movement, called Racial Realism. And basically his thesis in that essay is that, institutional racism isn't going away. Systemic racism isn't going away. It can't go away. We can't beat it. The best we can do is fight back in order to maintain our dignity, right? So if you're convinced you can't win, and it's really about, maintaining your dignity, what do you care about reason and rationality? Or even the truth, right? What do you care about those things? And now we're getting back to the whole tear it all down thing that seems to be a refrain in my field. I assume it is in others as well. So this is all coming from mistrust in classical liberal values and a lack of faith in our ability to change things for the better when it comes to race. You put those things together, and you have things like the demonization of individuality and a lack of willingness to converse in a reasonable way, right? And all those things.
So how do you get that trust back? Is that even possible without, I mean, just with destroying or like maybe theory of empowerment is how we build that trust back if we were to employ that, right?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That's my hypothesis right now.
Mm-hmm.
So years ago, I'm sorry, Jason, you want to chime in first?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one thing that's unique to humans is that we have the ability to see each other as we see ourselves. And that whenever we can do that, it basically creates a psychological situation to where you cannot do that person harm. So if we can practice doing that, and what the world of critical race theory and intersectionality do is that they purposely they separate us. So we are creating psychological systems now that prevent us from seeing each other as we see ourselves. Therefore, we will always harm the other. And that mistrust that Eric talked about, not just of the classical liberal system, but we are now setting up systems and structures to where we do not trust each other. So the world of if the critical race theorists, if their hearts are set on improving the human condition and decreasing the amount of time, then they have to abandon the practices that they're using right now, because the practices that they're using right now are purposed for destruction.
And have
So
engendered that distrust. I mean, if we had distrust before, we have it, threefold now.
threefold. It's even
More,
in
100-fold.
and I spend a lot of time hanging out in, I guess, quote unquote, non-normative identity groups. And to see what is happening in each one of those groups, the division and the mistrust of even within the group, how even the groups are fracturing and splintering. I'm like, well, that's what this ideology was purposed to do.
Right.
The intention is to overthrow Western civilization. So
Right.
and in order to do that, you have to completely break down the individual. You confuse them, disorient them, and you make them think that they are worthless. And you get them to look at each other. We're being programmed to look at each other in the most negative ways. We're being, even ourselves, no matter what identity group that you're in, which oppressor group or which oppressed groups, we're being asked to think of ourselves in the most unpleasant way and think of each other in the most unpleasant way. And for some reason, we expect that doing that is going to yield a better version of us.
Right. So years ago, this goes back into the late 1990s, I was part of a very high level Black Jewish dialogue group with some real major folks in both the Jewish community and the Black community. And we would have discussions about all the problems in the world and school system in the District of Columbia and the rest. But not once in my memory did we ever talk about why there was disparity. We didn't argue about that. It wasn't really on the plate. It was, what are we going to do about it? And at one point in time, we held a joint bus tour with some of the African American groups where we went into sort of the inner city and looked at some of the issues. And at one point, a vice president of real estate for a major company who was Jewish had this aha moment and said, wow, there are no Black faces in the commercial real estate business. I just realized that. None. I was totally blind to it. He didn't spend a second asking whether that was because of systemic racism, if it was because of just historic conditions of Black people not being in any proximity to the real estate industry, if there was some cultural factor that might have been at work. It didn't really cross his mind, I don't think. It was just that there was this disparity. It was problematic. We had to solve it. And he created something called the Real Estate Apprentice Program, which trained young Black kids in real estate and gave them incredible opportunities. And over the course of many years, he brought many Black folks into the commercial real estate industry. And I'm just wondering, have we lost our way because we spend so much of our time and energy on these ideological questions about why there's differences rather than, yes, there's differences. We don't know. It's complicated. There are multifactorial reasons for them. But we've got to go about resolving them and addressing them, not about debating why they exist in the first place.
Yeah, I think we overemphasize the problem and underemphasize the solution.
Yeah.
trying to collaborate.
That's a good line, by the way, Eric. I'm going to use that. Thank you.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Okay.
And yeah, I think that's happening often. I was going to say something else too, regarding the international component and everything you just said. But I can't come up with it right now, so I'm done.
Well, you gave us one of the best lines I've heard in a while, so I'm going to overemphasize the problem and underemphasize the solution. And that is such a powerful cultural critique as well. It tells you where we are in our discourse and what's gone wrong when we're spending all this time talking about the problem and why it exists. You know, I've been very involved in criminal justice reform in the last several years, and it was really about dealing with the problem of mass incarceration. And at one point, I remember asking some folks who are very active, said, well, what happens if I don't believe that white supremacy is the root cause of all this? What if I think it's more complicated than that? And I got a really disturbing answer. It was like, that basically said, you're not part of this coalition then. In other words, it was really all about the problem and nothing about the solution in their view. And I think that's really problematic.
You reminded me of what I was going to say, and now I forgot it again. No, I'm kidding.
No. Write it down, please.
No, I mean, meaning and understanding, and the best way to solve a problem are collaborative efforts, right? And the interactional behavioral are all about that. They're all about collaborative efforts. The problem with a lot of contemporary anti-racism is that it's not looking for instances of racism. It's already assuming they're there, right? And we're just going to figure out where it is or how to explain it. They start with the conclusion that racism's there. Robin DiAngelo and people like that actually say that explicitly. Don't ask whether something racist happened. Ask how it manifested in this situation, which is to say the racism is always already there, right? And if you're starting from that kind of major proposition, unquestionably, then you're already stifling yourself. And you're already forcing yourself to look at the problem more than the solution.
Right. It doesn't exactly engender collaboration, does it? When
Right.
you start with one group is completely at fault. And we know that there are historical reasons to blame one group more than other groups, but still, when you start on that level, it doesn't exactly empower people to get involved to actually find solutions that make sense for everybody.
Well, not only that, but you find, what's that adage? You find what you're looking for. So if you assume racism is everywhere, you find it everywhere, from dogs are racist to, math is racist. And so much so. And this is what you kind of want to tell this story. So I'm reading essays right now. I'm one of the judges for an essay contest from students that revolve around issues of free speech and speaking up and speaking your mind. Thousands of essays. And I'm so dismayed because so many of these essays are based on I am this identity, group identity. And these are our young kids. And this is where I worry. And this is where I love the theory of empowerment. But this is where I worry with what Jason was saying with, social and emotional learning, is that this is what we're teaching our kids. And it becomes, I think Jason mentioned this, it becomes part of the new mindset or part of the new wiring, the software, I believe is what Jason said, where when you kind of grow up that way, and that's your wiring, then it's so much harder to rewire as you get older versus to teach habits when you're younger. And like I said, my experience is I'm seeing, I know that Jason said that he was seeing this in his classrooms, but I'm seeing it in I have to tell you, literally almost every single essay, I'm exaggerating, at least 50%, at least, have to do with race and racial essentialism.
Yeah.
In some
from
ways,
all over the United States.
In some ways, I wonder if this entire enterprise is sacrificing the well-being of Black people in order to get white people to take more responsibility for their history and legacy. and that would be the ultimate double victimization, it seems to me. If we're trying to get white people to take responsibility for racism, and in doing so, making it more difficult for black people to succeed in a society that's not going to radically shift, that we're still going to have to do math, and you're going to still have to, achieve in education, and you're going to still have to report to work on time. If it just seems to me that's the biggest tragedy of the current discourse, is it actually harms the people it's supposed to help.
Well, yes.
It,
I have no response to that other than a exuberant head nod. I
Right.
wholeheartedly with everything.
Maybe white people are doing a disservice to by in some ways by trying to make it so the only acceptable explanation in the world is racism. They're just not helping. It's just not a helpful framework for society.
And the white people that are heavily bought into this idea do not view black people in a positive light, and I can attest to that from conversations and things that they've revealed to me, that I see them acting out of kindness, but I see how they view people as less than.
Yeah.
I see that in my interactions with people that say they care, but have been wired to believe awful things. Earlier, I heard y'all talking about, how Eric mentioned we overstress the problem and don't really talk about solutions, and then how that's what we're doing. So that's all critical theory is. Critical theory, we talk a lot about critical race theory, but critical theory, the 1937 idea that was like, hey, if we give people this tool of critical theory, over time, they'll destroy themselves. And what critical theory, in one hand, you point out the problems, you see the problem in every situation, in every human interaction, in every situation from the past. The problem is always present. And then also dream about utopia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's why, society's starting to understand, like, golly, we just talk about the problems and everybody's so cynical. Well, we've been given this idea to destroy ourselves. And it is that idea as a solution finding tool is ineffective. And then with the postmodern element of removing the notion of a truth, even removing the notion that truth is possible, and combining those two things with intensified tribalism and intensifying othering, those things, the melding of those is essentially a psycho technology that is being laid upon us, and is wiring us. That is now the culture, and that's what's wiring us. And our brains are wired to fit themselves to psychotechnologies. And psychotechnologies are just essentially information processing ways to link our brains to each other, and also ways to link our brains to like our future selves, our past selves, and our current selves, using like language, exchange of money, religion, and science, and all these big frameworks are essentially psychotechnologies. And this ideology, this new way of being, is being placed on us, and our brains are forming to this whether we want them to or not. So I think that's why it's real important work that Eric and I are doing, is calling that to an attention and saying, listen, we have a real unique opportunity here. The problem solving and things are up on the surface. We know what needs to be fixed. We know what the problems are. We know we've got these two worldviews that we can choose. But humanity, I feel, is at this bottleneck position, and we are either not to be too optimistic or pessimistic, but we are either through that bottleneck going to go the way that we did at the conclusion of the Bronze Age, which was enter the Dark Ages, or we're going to go the way of the Renaissance and Reformation, where this idea of the individual and the divine rights of man and all of that really happened.
Okay, so on a final question for you guys, where are you most concerned and where are you most optimistic? So, I mean, to follow up with you, what you just said, Jason, I mean, where do you see that we're going into the Dark Ages or into a Renaissance? What are your hopes and what are your fears? Or what do you see that's aspirational and what is, we already know it's scary pretty much, but.
Well, my hopes are the Renaissance, and my hopes and my fears are all placed on the children right now. I'm fearful that they will accept what the adults and what the establishment is telling them is truth. But also, what I'm hopeful is that teenagers and younger people are wired in a way to reject the things that they see in the world that don't make sense to them. So I'm very hopeful that young people will start to realize that, you know what, we're being played. Generations above us have been played. Why don't we stop and why don't we do something else? So a lot of hope on young people as well, and those working with young people to mentor and to inspire and to change the direction that way.
Eric, what about you? Any?
My hopes and fears.
Yeah.
My hope is that we come out of this and have a re-enlightenment. You know, I don't know if we create too many new concepts, but we do re-embrace some of the old ones, like reason. I like reason.
Reason's nice.
Reason's nice. My fear is that because so many people are adamantly opposed to reason and dialogue and things like that, that they won't be able to, take steps towards empowerment. Right? They're already too far gone. Right? And they know that if we can't trust reason, and this is reason, then what are we going to do? There's a concept from a rhetorician, he passed away a few years ago, named Wayne Booth, who talks about listening rhetoric. And listening rhetoric at its best sense, and he has devolutions of it as he goes on, but in its best sense is I'm going to listen to you, you're going to listen to me, and we're both going to arrive at a truth, all right? We're both going to arrive at something that works for the betterment of society, regardless of, the solution we wanted to have or something like that. Mm-hmm. It devolves though, and listening rhetoric, there's listening rhetoric A, B, listening rhetoric C is a kind of negative version of it, and it basically says, I'm going to listen to you so that I can find your weaknesses and then destroy you, right? So that's it's bad faith listening.
Right.
There is a lot of people in anti-racist circles, social justice circles, assume listening rhetoric C. They just assume if you're not on their side, but you really just want to talk and have a sincere dialogue, you're acting in bad faith. Then what you're really trying to do is use reason as a weapon to ruin us so that we can't get what we want. So if that's the attitude, I'm not entirely sure, how to get past that other than modeling what it means to be empowered as an individual and as a group, showing people, not telling people. That's kind of where I'm going now. But my biggest fear is that listening rhetoric C will win out.
Yeah, and I think that, we talked with Greg Lukianoff the other day, and one of the things that he was saying in terms of like free speech was, we have to deal in a reality of social media, and that is a huge landscape that I'm guessing we all didn't grow up with it, where it makes that listening aspect really, really difficult. Yeah. I believe. So that's a new challenge. I've got Eric. This is a little bit of a goofy aside. I know that you like Buddhism
Yeah.
and Buddhist rhetoric. And Jason and I don't know if you know this about Jason. We both lived in China. He lived in Chongqing. I lived in Nanjing. So
Okay.
not that that's the birth. Buddhism was born. We know it was from India, but we've got those Asian like influences and whatnot that we both are kind of attracted to. Give us end us off with some like good, perhaps where Buddhism and the theory of empowerment might intersect, and if there's anything to learn from Buddhism that might bring us to that moment that we're all looking for.
In my studies, I landed on what's called Nichiren Buddhism, which is a 13th century Japanese form of Buddhism that uses the Lotus Sutra as a primary text.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of fell out of favor, and then towards the middle of the 20th century, it had a resurgence, and a lay organization of teachers, really, educators, saw the educational benefit to it, because it had a lot to do with American pragmatism. This form of Buddhism overlapped with American pragmatism. Some of the theories of John Dewey, especially George Herbert Mead, right? The importance of empowerment and being oriented with a goal, and realizing that there's a difference between truth and value. Truth is what it is. We create value. If we can create that together, it will make for a better society, right? These are all also aspects of Nichiren Buddhism. So I looked into that, and I was trying to analyze the rhetoric of Nichiren Buddhism and how it overlaps with the tenets of American pragmatism. And I was going to explore that and do a very deep dive. But then wokeness happened, and I got distracted. So here I am.
Although it sounds like that's really interesting, perhaps parallel to kind of some of the stuff.
It's explicitly against victimhood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Explicitly, he says, don't disparage your life at all. Just know that you can develop your inner Buddhahood. Victimhood is against my religion, I could say, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very interesting.
Well, that was an awesome way to wrap up. Thank you so much, you guys. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.